Hello, all. My name is Masha Pearl, Executive Director of the Blue Card, the only organization in the United States with the sole mission of assisting Holocaust survivors in need. On a somber note, today we begin our podcast with thinking of the people and the tragedy in Ukraine. And while we are thankful to be safe, our thoughts are with the Holocaust survivors. Currently, there are 10,000 Holocaust survivors living in Ukraine. Many are isolated and homebound. And the current situation is re-traumatizing them and reminding them of the experiences they endured during the war years. This, combined with the uncertainty of their situation, gives the Blue Card great concern. And therefore, we have partnered with Survivor Mitzvah Project, which provides direct assistance to Holocaust survivors on the ground throughout Ukraine and checking on their welfare, delivering goods and services, and caregiver aid. We welcome you to please join us in this critical and time-sensitive effort. And with that, I would like to introduce our next episode. And with us, we have renowned Holocaust survivor, psychologist, Dr. Eva Fogelman. And we also have Stefanie Setzler, the founder and president of the World Federation of Jewish Child Survivors of the Holocaust. This amazing organization has hosted 32 annual conferences. And just a little bit about Stefanie. Stefanie Setzler was born in Lodz, Poland. Stefanie and her family lived in Radomsko, where in 1942, 10,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka, including many of her family members. Today, Stefanie will share with us her miraculous story of survival and how she was reunited with her mother and their journey together to the United States in 1952, as well as life in America thereafter. It's a pleasure to have Stefanie here with us today. I would like to now open it up for a discussion with Dr. Fogelman and Stefanie Setzler.
Thank you, Stefanie, for the honor to interview you. We met 35 years ago in the backyard of your house in Philadelphia for a picnic with other Holocaust child survivors. And since then, you have brought together hundreds and hundreds of Holocaust child survivors from all over the world on an annual basis. And it has given people community. Many people who felt they were isolated and alone felt that they were part of an extended family, since many of them did not have families because they were all murdered during the German occupations of their countries. So thank you for everything. And today, people will get to know what is behind the woman who has done so much for the Holocaust survivor community. So I'd like to begin, Stefanie, our interview today with asking you a little bit about your family before you were born. Since you were born in 1938 in June, about a year before the Germans invaded Lodz, where you were born. And since you don't have any memories of life before the invasion, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, your mother, your father, your extended family, and what you had learned about them.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes. Just as you mentioned, I was too young to remember anything. I didn't remember anything before the war. I had not existed then. I was just born in 38. But I have very early memories of life in the ghetto. And, I've done a lot of speaking at schools, colleges, everywhere in different states, different countries even. And sometimes students have asked me, you were so young, but why? How is it that you can remember? And I gave it some thought, and I came up with this answer that, when every day is like every other day, you don't remember. But when every day could be the difference between life and death, you remember. And that's how it was in my life. Right. Every day was a different situation, and I never knew what was next. And also, I should mention that it really resonates today with what's going on in the Ukraine. But also, when I hear, different stories, it makes me think, and I've heard it said, that my mother was very resilient. You know, she always told me, don't say anything, be quiet, you know, don't cry. And no matter what happened, no matter how painful something was physically or otherwise, I never complained. My mother always said, you know, days without food, et cetera, but I never complained. And that probably did help me to survive.
Having a mother who was so resilient herself and knew how to cope with with such a trauma, which, you know, a trauma is when you have so many stimuli that it's impossible to deal with, that she clearly, you know, was a very strong woman. But before we get into your to what happened after the Germans invaded Lodz, why don't you tell us a little bit about your mother and father and your extended family and who they were in Lodz for
Yes,
many
yes, of course.
years?
So I was born in Lodz, which was where both on my mother's side, my mother and father were first cousins, you know, which was not at all uncommon back then. And I was born in Lodz. And then my paternal grandparents had a glass factory and a retail store in Radomsko. And I don't recall when we moved out of Lodz to be in Radomsko because I was too young, but I do remember being in Radomsko in the ghetto with my paternal grandparents. And I recall very clearly how we lived in my paternal grandparents' apartment in the ghetto.
You came from a family that was well-to-do, and also your parents were educated. Tell us about their education before the war.
I don't know what degree my father had. You know, he was the youngest of 5 children. And in those days, the older children had a choice of what education they wanted and go to medical school or whatever. My father didn't have that choice, being the youngest. He was designated to take over the business. Yeah. So he had to stay. But my mother had a year of pre-medical before she got married. And in some ways that helped a lot because she was able to fake it. And during the war in Warsaw, she faked it and said that she was an operating room nurse, and she got a job working as an operating room nurse in the largest hospital in Warsaw, the Hospital of the Child Jesus. So that was good. And as I said, she had the guts to do it, to say that.
She sure did, yeah. What was so incredible in Lodz is that the Germans didn't wait very long, and a year after they invaded Lodz, in 1939, September of 39, in June of 1940, they already started transporting the Jews of Lodz to the Radomsko ghetto, and so you must have been deported.
Yes.
Obviously, you were deported when you were, you know,
Yeah.
less than 2 years old. So obviously, you don't remember. What is your first memory in the Radomsko ghetto?
No, I remember very clearly. There is a woman, she's still alive. We discussed, and you know her name. Yes, Helen Fagan, 103 years old. And I've connected with her a number of times. I've gone to see her in Florida. And she remembered, she was my cousin. My cousin was 12 years older than I, my cousin Bronca. And she was her teacher in the secret school in the ghetto in Radomsko. And I found her, you know, in New York. I found her when I was in New York talking to Bronca, and connected with her and went to see her in Florida. And one day she asked me, do you remember the apartment in the ghetto? And I said, yes. And she said, shall we do a walkthrough? Those literally her words. And I said, yes. And I described exactly as you walked into the apartment where everything was. As you walked in, the kitchen was on the left. And my mother had brought 2 canaries in cages, and they were hanging in the kitchen in their cages. And then you walked ahead, and there was a large dining room table. And I know where everybody was seated in the ghetto, in this apartment.
And what other family members were with you in the ghetto?
Yes, my paternal grandparents And I remember that we were sitting there every day. And I guess my grandfather must have had poor, circulation, because they used to come and bind his legs. No, he had the one, they put leeches. He had high blood pressure. In those days, that was considered the help. They put leeches on his temples. And also my grandmother, she was the one with high blood pressure, evidently. They bound her legs every day at the table. And my mother's brother was seated there as well. And my father's one sister, who had a little girl approximately my age, who did not survive, she also was there. And that's.
And how did you escape from the ghetto?
Well, my mother, as I said, had a great deal of foresight. And she evidently, it's written in a book, which I have, Children of Dust in Heaven. I have it up there on the shelf, written by Stefanie Setzler, who was in school in Radomsko, in the secret school with my cousin Bronka. She then, after the war, went to Cape Town, South Africa, and she wrote this book. And in the book, she writes that my daughter would not, that a diary was found in the ghetto after the war by a woman who did not survive. But in the diary, it states, my child would not be alive today if it were not for my friend, Dunka Fishman. That was my mother. And she quotes that my mother had gone to people in the ghetto and had said, what are you waiting for? Get your children out of here. And people said to her, what are you talking about? An intelligent people from a country like Germany, a cultured country, the country of Mozart and Schiller, they're not going to be killing women and children. And my mother said, yes, they are. They want to go after all of us. And so then my mother, after, as I said, urging other people to do the same, somehow was able to hire a woman to come into the ghetto and smuggle me out. Of course, it was only after the war that I found out that this had been a prostitute. Why a prostitute? Because there was no contraception in those days, and prostitutes had children. So a prostitute could pass off another child as being her own. And especially so, since I could easily pass, I was blonde and blue-eyed. So, and I spoke Polish. I didn't come from a Yiddish-speaking home. So in this instance, it really helped.
And do you remember being taken out of the ghetto, and where were you taken to?
I certainly remember, to prepare me for leaving the ghetto, my mother wanted me to have a doll because I wanted a doll. And in those days, the dolls were made with I guess it was a plastic kind of head, and the body had to be stuffed with sawdust. And I remember my mother preparing such a doll, my cousin Bronka holding me by the hand and going to the store that had been my grandparents' store, glass store. And what did they use for packaging glassware? They used sawdust. And so we were on the way to the store to stuff the body of the doll. And two Germans in a Jeep were following us, trying to run us down. And every time they failed to run us down, they would just lean back and laugh. And finally, we got to the store and had to go up some stairs, and they just leaned back and laughed and left the area. So that was a very memorable moment for me. And anyway, I got the doll stuffed, and so my mother arranged for me to come out of the ghetto with that doll. But she had arranged for this prostitute to take me, and the prostitute took me to what I assumed was her mother in a very, very primitive village, nothing like villages in the United States, in, way out of Warsaw. And
no water, no toilets.
Outhouses, not even outhouses, really just ditches.
Just outside.
And so a couple of things happened there. First, there was a boy approximately my age. And one day they were cooking outside, lit a fire, and he took my doll and threw it into the fire. And I never again, throughout the war, had a doll or any other toy. It was very, very hard for me, believe me. I also should tell you that after the war, when I was reunited with my mother and she was hospitalized after the war, when she came out of the hospital, in one cage, she carried a cage. In one hand, she carried a cage with a canary in it. And in the other hand, she carried a doll for me. Yeah.
Did you stay in that house for the duration of the war, or what
No,
happened?
I guess my mother must have thought that I would be able to, but you know, that woman had already been paid. She had our money, she had everything. So she one day called her daughter, who was that prostitute, and that prostitute came to get me. And I don't know, must have been quite a period of time that had elapsed between the time I had been smuggled out of the ghetto and that time, because I remember that prostitute taking me by the hand, and we wound up taking the train to Warsaw. And we met a train there also. And a woman came out and she didn't look like my mother. I didn't recognize her as my mother. She had a different hair color and she was very thin, etc. But this woman was holding me by the hand and walking around the streets of Warsaw with me and kept telling me that she was my mother, and I didn't recognize her as such, but she was telling me so much about the apartment in the ghetto that finally I realized this must be my mother because she knows so much about me. So that first night, this woman, my mother, tried to find a place for us to spend the night. And I remember going up in various apartment buildings up the stairs, trying to find a place where we might spend the night. And finally, we found a place, you know, stairs above the last apartment, and we slept on the floor there. And the next day, again, my mother started taking me various places, and we wound up in a place called, it's a suburb of Warsaw, Żoliborz. It's a lovely, lovely suburb now also, a very, very lovely suburb. And it was lovely back then for its time. And I guess my mother remembered that on my father's side of the family, someone had married a non-Jewish scientist. And we wound up going to that place, the home of what had been the scientist's home. And I remember my mother standing there holding my hand, knocking on the door, and a woman came to the door, and my mother introduced herself and said who she was. And the woman said, "Come in." And she offered to share her ration card with us. We had no ration card. Her name was Adela Kaluszinska, a wonderful, wonderful woman. And my mother had a bleeding ulcer, so she was lying down, you know, and we were actually in hiding. We didn't have papers. And there were also two sisters hidden in another room, and they had to be really hidden. But I was not quite 4, I guess, about 4. And I got a job with a man who was very resourceful also. He had dug up what had been an area dividing the two sides of the street in Żoliborz. And before the war, there had evidently been beautiful flowers and shrubs planted. He dug it all up and planted potatoes. And I got a job with him weeding the potatoes.
4
And at
years
the end of
old.
the day, yes, at the end of the day, he would pay me with potatoes. And I would bring those back to the house where I was hidden with my mother. Mm-hmm.
How long did you stay there?
I don't know the time. I think maybe a longer period of weeks, maybe some months, but it became too dangerous to be there because the daughter of Pani Kaluszinska, the woman with whom we're staying, was found to be carrying secret papers working for the underground. The Germans found that. So the whole street became endangered because the Germans were going door to door thinking that she had collaborators working with her, people on that street. So we had to escape. So we went to different places. I remember several different places, but eventually we came back to that street. But this young woman who had been found to be carrying those secret papers, I do remember clearly they announced on the radio, they would announce the different tortures that they were inflicting on her. So they pulled out her fingernails, they said, and other things. It was terrible to have to listen to and to know that this was happening to her, a young woman.
So you must have been hidden in quite a few places.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Did your mother at some point have any false identification papers that she was able to move around?
She had some, yes, she did have some. And she had a paper evidently from a priest, with her, not her real name, of course, and a picture of a woman approximately her age, And so she was able to get a job. She had, as I said, a year of pre-medical school before the war, medical school. So she got a job at that hospital, and that's how she was able to earn some money, but it was not enough. But she had an ID card, she had a ration card. But in order to earn some extra money, she would take on jobs taking care of patients who had had surgery or seriously ill. She would take care of them at night in their rooms in the hospital. And with that money, she would pay the woman who was hiding me and keeping me.
Right. And what happened to your father in the ghetto?
Well, I never saw him after I left the ghetto. And I didn't find out until much later that he had been killed in the ghetto. And it wasn't, of course, I always wanted to know more about my father. I had remembered, I don't have any memories of my mother being very gentle with me or affectionate, but I have memories like that from my father. I remember being very sick. Evidently, I had whooping cough, which you may know is not an easy disease to have. I remember being very sick. And my father, I remember this lying there, and my father would come by and gently stroke my forehead. And also this one cousin that was in the same hiding place with me, I don't know what we did, but one day we did something evidently not the best behavior. So other people, my mother slapped me for it, but he took us out on the balcony in the ghetto in Radomsko. And he discussed with us what had been inappropriate behavior. That was my father. And I didn't find out much more about him until my cousin, Jerry Fishman, whose name is Haskell Fishman, he survived. He had been studying in England at Manchester, and he survived the war, and he served in the British Army. After the war, he couldn't come into the United States. He came to Canada. But when he was able to enter the United States, he came to New York, and I was able to ask him. By that time, I was like 16, 17. I was able to ask him about my father. And he told me just really, really moving things. He said, my father, being the youngest of 5 children in the Fishman family, was closer in age to the cousins than he was to his own siblings. And they all liked him very much, the cousins. And he told me about my father, that my father would go and collect stones somehow, and he would lay them out in patterns. And he told me how gentle my father had been. And those are the only memories I have. And also, I don't have a single picture of my father, not a single picture. And I know my mother tried very hard after the war to get a picture. And also my father's oldest brother had survived in Shanghai. And I knew that they had a family album because when we came to New York, they still had it. But then after my uncle died, I hadn't thought to ask, I didn't have the nerve to ask for the album before. But afterwards, I did ask for it, and nobody knew what had happened to the album. And so I don't have a single picture of my father. Just a memory that he must have been quite tall, because I remember there was a gate coming into the ghetto where we were coming into that particular apartment building. And I remember that my father had to really bend very hard to get under it. but it's very painful to me. And I have to tell you, to this day, in a way, I had hoped after the war, I heard stories of people who had been declared dead. Everybody had said, oh, yes, they were taken here, they were taken there, they're dead. But there were instances where these people were alive. When we were in the camp after like a DP camp in Vienna after the war, in the same room, you know, the DP camp had been a school and we were like 24 people in one room. And one of them was a pregnant woman. She had become pregnant from the man that she had married after the war. And in those days, you had to have a statement from two people saying that they knew that person had been killed, was no longer alive. So this woman must have made that statement, and yet her husband came back. Her first husband did come back.
But that gave you some kind of sense of hope that your father would come back.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that hope didn't go away, I have to tell you. It stayed and stayed with me for years.
Do you remember Liberation Day, and did you go back to Lodz or Radomsko?
Well, we were liberated by the Russians. You know, we were marched out of Warsaw during the Warsaw. First, it was a Warsaw uprising. You know, the Polish people rose up against the Germans. We were in that march. It was terrible. And then we were, again, you know, the bullets were flying, the grenades were flying. My mother, I was in a hiding place at that point with a woman named, I called her Chocha Lucia and Lucy. She was hiding me. And I had to be under the dining room table. In those days, they had long tablecloths going down to the floor. And I was hidden under the table. I had a party chair under there, but I was afraid to use it. I had no toy, nothing at all. My toy had been taken away. So I used to just pull out my hair one at a time, and I would lay it down on the floor, and I would make like heart shapes and flower shapes. And that was my, you know, that's how I kept myself busy. And as I said, that's where it happened. You know, I was there for maybe 3 months. The only food we had was just like black bread seeped in really black, terrible oil. And we had 1 tablespoon of cod liver oil every morning. That was the nourishment. And the other very significant thing that I always speak about when I speak to young people, here I am under the table. This wonderful woman, Chocha Lucia, is hiding me. Yes, my mother is paying her with whatever she earns working in the hospital, but she's still risking her life and that of her daughter who was living there. If she were to be found. I was not allowed to come up to the window because I didn't officially exist. Anybody who was looking up and would see me, that would be giving me away and risking that.
Yes to them too.
Yes, exactly. So this wonderful woman, Chocha Lucia, was keeping me under those circumstances. And the thing is that's so very hard to understand. As I said, the tablecloth went down to the floor, and I was there, and her brother, this woman's brother, was a Jew hunter for the Gestapo. He would go out on the streets of Warsaw every day because, you know, the Germans didn't know the Jews so well. They couldn't identify. And it's not that he knew every Jew, but he was more likely to recognize who was Jewish and who wasn't. And he was local in the area. So he would sit not very far from me, maybe, I don't know, 3-4 feet at the very most, maybe less, 3 maybe. He would sit there and that's where he would sleep. And I was hidden under the dining room table. And I had a party chair, but I was afraid to make any noise. And that's where I was for about 3 months, mostly under the table. This was towards the end of the war, my last hiding place. And I guess when my mother came to get me, I guess she thought that I would be able to walk out of there. But we went down and she found I just couldn't walk. So as I said, my mother was very resourceful. So she flagged a droshka. You know, a droshka is a person-driven cart. And we were in it trying to get to the suburb where I had been before, where this woman had been, where my mother had first gone, but the grenades were falling and, bullets were flying. We had to get out of that droshka. And I remember we crawled, perhaps for as much as 2 days on and off. We crawled until we found a place that I remembered as a fortress. My mind said it was a fortress. And my adult mind said, what, a fortress in Warsaw? That can't be. And then when we had our first child survivor conference, we had our workshops. And one of the workshops, we spoke about some of these memories that we didn't even trust. We didn't trust our own memories. And somebody very clever from Montreal said, well, we have to call that validating our memories. And that is true, because on the return visit to Warsaw sometime in the 70s, mid-70s, I went there, I stood there, and sure enough, at the end of that street, Plac Inwalidów, the place of invalids in Warsaw, is this fortress. And I kept walking around there, and finally a man stopped me and said, you're walking around here all the time. What's the matter? What are you doing here? And I said, well, I was hidden there during the war. I was inside during the war. And I just can't believe this is still here. He said, oh, yes, this dates back to the war between Poland and Russia. So it had been here for, I don't know, a couple hundred years.
Years, right? That was more
And
than-
that is
more than
validating.
20 years at that time. Wow.
Yeah.
So I have a question about, you're a year old when the war begins. You are 7 years old when the war ends, and you obviously your body grew, your feet grew. How did you get shoes that fit you when you were 7 years old?
I
What happened? How did you have shoes?
I didn't have shoes during the war. I had severe frostbite, frozen feet. And, after the war, I was treated for that in Vienna. I was treated. They wrapped like black wrap around my feet, hot, wraps around my feet, and it got better. But I have to tell you something. It came back a few years ago, that problem came back of the frozen feet. It's not something that gets cured so easily. Yeah.
So you did not have shoes.
I
throughout the-
tried when we were marched out of Warsaw. That's just it. I didn't have shoes. So my mother just put something, on my feet, schmatters on my feet, but I did not have shoes. There was nothing my size, my feet had grown.
So the first time you had shoes, did you have shoes when you after liberation before you went to Vienna? Did you get some shoes then?
Yes. I don't know how my mother got some shoes. Not exactly the right thing, but I was something to put on my feet.
And how long did you stay in Lodz before you went to Vienna?
Well, we just stayed in Lodz, and my mother went back to Radomsko to check. We stayed in Lodz just to, everybody was going to what had been Jewish places of worship, Jewish schools, etc., because people would put their names there. And that's how my cousin Bronka found us, my mother and me. And she had been, I talked her into doing the Shoah interviews, and she did that. And she states that in the Shoah interview, that if she had actually had a child with the son of the family that she was working for during the war, to survive. She had gotten out of the ghetto.
Right.
She was 12 years older. And so that's when she found our name on that list. So we stayed longer to be sure somebody else came. So my father's oldest brother had survived 3 concentration camps. And so we knew he was alive. We met with them. And then he and Bronka went to Vienna, Austria before we did. And then my mother and I, and by then the border was closed. Russians were in Poland, the border was closed. My mother and I sat on the border for 6 weeks trying to get out of Poland. And we eventually did, took a train. And it was very strange, we were told, I had this clear memory that when we got on the trains, we were told, if Russian soldiers come on the train and they want to speak to you in Russian, make believe you don't understand a word. Make believe you don't understand Polish. Make believe you don't understand Russian. Of course, I didn't understand what this was all about. I'm not sure that any adults knew what it was all about either. And it wasn't until after I was in the United States, it must have been in the maybe the 2000s, yes, late, maybe more than just 20 years ago, there was a meeting at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. about the DP camps.
Yes.
Special conference. And
I was one of the organizers.
Right, and I went to that conference and they
Like
had this
reborn.
meeting. And you'll have to tell me more about that. But anyway, I went to that meeting, and that's when I first found out why we were told not to acknowledge that we understood Polish or Russian or anything like that. And that was because we were supposed to be Turks fleeing, because after the war, people of all nationalities were on the road. I forgot, I've read the statistics about how many millions literally were on the road trying to get back to their home countries. And that's why we were not supposed to acknowledge that we understood either Polish or Russian. That was very interesting coming to that meeting in
Yes,
DC.
to finally know why. That's helpful. Now, what do you know the name of the DP camp you were in Austria?
Oh, yes, I can. Well, I was in two different ones. One was in Hernals, a suburb of Vienna, Hernals. And then when that one closed, we moved to a place my mother rented from a woman, strangely enough. That was Hernalser Hauptstraße 199. That was the apartment. And we were subletting from a woman. And she was an older, kind woman. And she was kind of subletting. She was renting from her sister. And, after I went back to Vienna in 1975 with my two sons, I wanted to show them what this had been. We went there and we're standing in front of that house, and the woman she calls down, "Ein Moment bitte," she comes down and she says, "What is so photogenic about my house that you're taking this picture?" And I said, "Well, we lived down here in those times." And she said, "Yes, I remember." And she remembered my name and everything. We had never talked to that particular woman before. We were renting from the woman who was subletting from her. We were renting one room for somebody who was renting two rooms. We never talked to her because her husband had been the head Nazi of that district of Vienna. So we had nothing to say to them. And here this woman, I just talked to kids about that. And here's this woman, she comes downstairs and she sees me. And as I said, she said she remembers me. Excuse me. And she says to me, "And where is your mother? How is your mother?" And I said, "My mother passed away." And she starts crying.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
Yeah. Even now I get goosebumps thinking about it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it was very, very strange. But the woman from who we were renting, her name was Frau Dienstkoch. And she was a lovely, lovely older woman, very lovely. And she she was just wonderful. She taught me many things. She taught me to observe Mother's Day. And she would have a little Christmas tree that she would have in her room, and she let me decorate it. And she was just, oh yes, she taught me about, I was learning German, I read in the newspaper, oh gosh, I'm not remember the word, it means gestaltigt, it means like raped, had sex with. And I asked her, "What does that word mean?" And she said to me, It means sex between man and a woman. And then I see something a couple of weeks later in the newspaper about this going on between two men. And I said, how is that possible? You explained it to me. And she explained that one to me too. And this was Frau Dienstkoch, and I was in touch with her after I still came to the United States, wrote in German. And
So getting to, here you are, so you are now, by the time you're in Vienna, you're almost 8 years old. And could you tell us a little bit about your education and how did you make up all those years that you didn't have education and kindergarten and?
No, I had none. I didn't go to school in Poland or anything. So I first started school in Vienna. I had to learn German, and I started in 4th grade. And I was doing okay. By the end of 9th grade, I was promoted, I was okay. I was doing well. And in fact, I started a little crazy project, with other kids. So I said, it was like a fraternity group, You had to walk down the street and you had to stop a perfect stranger on the street and say, oh, Uncle so-and-so. Oh, so nice to see you, of course, in German. And you had to make it seem as though you really knew that person. And I did that with these Austrian kids. But for us, it was entertaining, shall we say,
So were you in school also with some of the Jewish DPs as
No,
well?
I was the only one in the school that I went to, the only Jew. And I have to tell you, sometimes, like one time, a dirty joke was introduced at the school. And of course, I didn't know what the joke meant, but I was the one to blame for it. I was to blame for having brought it into the school, both from the teachers and, the parents. I was punished. But I did become friends with one girl in particular. She would invite me to her house, And my mother, after that time in there, she said she always had a suspicion that this girl might have had Jewish parents because she was living with a couple who were not her parents. And she was originally from Hungary and they had taken her. So it could be that she may have been, and she was dark-haired also. I wasn't dark-haired, but she was.
They may have adopted.
And I was in touch with her after I came to the United States for some years. I'm sorry I lost touch with her. I was always sorry that I had.
So you stayed in Vienna. Was your mother working in Vienna during this time that you were there?
We were in the DP camp first, and then my mother remarried in Vienna. She married a survivor also, who had lost 2 of his sons. He had survived in Siberia. And so then we tried to come to the United States. First we wanted to get out of there. So United States wasn't letting in East Europeans yet. And so we couldn't come. And I had taken out the book about Herzl, von Judenstadt zum Juden, from Judenhass zum Judenstadt, famous book.
The father of Zionism.
And I wanted to go to what was then Palestine. But, back then you had to take a boat, and my mother had a heart condition and it wasn't good. And as I said, the United States wasn't taking in refugees from Eastern Europe. So the only other place was to go to Australia, and that was too long and arduous a trip for my mother. So we waited until Hayas let us come to the United States, but I couldn't come yet because I had TB. So I had to undergo the TB cure in the mountains in the Austrian Alps by myself.
Were you quarantined for a while in Austria?
Not quarantine, no, they didn't do that then, but there were no drugs back then for that.
Right.
So the first time my mother took me to the mountains in Austria, the Semmering it's called, but she couldn't come again because of the altitude. She couldn't come because of her heart condition. So then she would send me a couple of summers in a row to a woman which today you would call like a B&B, It was a priest who owned this lovely house in Semmering, which is in the Austrian Alps. And this woman had 2 rooms, and she prepared 3 meals a day. So I was there in one room by myself. And I would just go out walking. My mother told me I'm not supposed to go walking long distances by myself, but I did. What else was there to do? And so I did that. And eventually I met a girl, and she would walk with me. Some other private things happened. So, I got my first period. I had no idea what it was. So I got it at 10 years of age because of the sudden, weight gain and everything. I had no idea what it was. So I remember thinking, well, something must have torn inside me. I thought it would get better, but it didn't. It was really bloody. But I remember passing on the street a doctor's sign. So I went there with a towel between my legs, and I waited and I waited. And the towel
You're so resilient.
Pardon?
You're so resilient.
Yeah. So I went out. I figured, well, I guess I'm not going to make it. How long can you bleed? There's only so much blood you have. So I took the chair and I put it by the window. And I decided, well, I'm just going to spend the night looking out at the window at the moon and the stars until I'm gone. And then in the morning, I was still there. So I still walked around with a towel between my legs, and a woman from the house next door caught on to what was happening. And she said to me, come with me, come with me. And she took me to the church, and she took me to the library there and took out a book for me to read. And the name of the book was Mädchenfrühling, which means spring in a girl's life. And I caught on as to what it was.
Wow. So you didn't even have your mother with you to explain things at that time.
No. And my mother later told me she hadn't explained it to me because she hadn't been menstruating until she was 18, because she was living through the First World War. So without nourishment and everything else, her period didn't come until later.
And do you remember, you came by ship to the United States? Do you remember seeing the Statue of Liberty, and where
The
did
General
you?
Muir, the General Muir. I barely caught sight because I had chicken pox aboard ship. And I shared it with all the young people on the ship because I had been made to work on the ship, in the kitchen dining room, the dining room for the young people. So 2 weeks later, a whole bunch of kids got chicken pox. I was taken, here we arrived in New York, and all these people had to get off. The ambulance came, and I was the first one off. 7 doctors came because they thought I had smallpox because I had such a severe case. And they took me to a hospital. I don't remember the name of the hospital, in total isolation. They put me in total isolation. And only once did a very nice Jewish woman from, who worked for Jewish Federations, I guess, from Teaneck, New Jersey, I remember. She came and brought my mother to see me, the only time. And that's where I was until I got over the chicken pox.
That was your welcome to America.
Yeah.
And where did the 3 of you live after that?
Oh, first they put us up in an apartment in Brooklyn. It was awful. And then my mother found out my one father's brother had survived in Shanghai, and he was living in Washington Heights. So every Sunday I would take the subway to Washington Heights. My mother didn't speak English, and as creative and as, resourceful as she had been during the war, after the war, it was all gone. So here I was at 13, and I had to find a place to live. And my stepfather's family had been here since way before the war, and they were wealthy. So they said if they would help us get an apartment if I found one. So I went from apartment building to apartment building on Bennett Avenue in New York, in Washington Heights, until I found an apartment, and that's where we moved in. But I continued going to the school where I had started when the Hayas put us up at the Hotel Albert on 14th Street.
By the way, sometimes, when people go through such a traumatic experience like your mother, where she had to be so resourceful all the time, and all the adrenaline that she had to use after the war, they collapsed.
Absolutely.
And that, by the way, happened to a lot of the rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. They were, so resourceful and risked their lives, and then afterwards, they just really had difficulty coping with life. But you had an amazing role model in terms of what to do.
Yeah.
And you now became your mother in a way, in terms of now you were taking care of her now.
Absolutely, I had to. Oh yes, to the very end, she just gave up. But her marriage was a very, very bad marriage. She took no steps, you know what I mean? In the refrigerator, there was her milk and there was his milk, and they didn't, I was not allowed to sit at the same table with him. He was just awful, but she let it go.
She didn't think about divorcing him, or I guess she had no energy to start all over again.
No.
It's been very difficult for you to see her
I
suffering.
actually ran away from home. I was working in the Catskills. I was not quite 17, I finished high school before I was 17. And I got a job in the Catskills, and I didn't want to go home to that situation. So I went home to his brothers. And my mother came to get me. She said, no, you're a minor, and I'll report you to the police if you don't come home. So I had to go there. And
in school, did you feel different from the other kids in the American school and high school, or did you meet any other child survivors in the school?
I knew there was a girl who was also a survivor. We both knew that we were each a survivor, but we never talked about it.
That was very common, by the way, for a child survivors not to talk about it, even though you sort of.
Yes. I remember, though, I always remember, we had been alone growing up until that stage. So I remember meeting in the bathroom when we were in school and discussing things about growing up, which we hadn't had a chance to discuss with anybody before.
And where did you go to college? I
started at City College of New York, which was then called the Harvard of the Poor,
Yes, it was. Yes.
I got in. I remember it was $10 to go.
Right.
And then I got married, which was much too early, a wrong marriage, but that's what happened. So I went to.
You were how old when you got married?
Pardon?
How old were you when you first married?
18.
Oh my goodness. So was this?
It was a form of escaping from home.
I was going to say that, escaping from home. Yeah. So you made the wrong decision.
Absolutely wrong.
Tell me a little bit about, you had 2 children with your first husband?
Yes, 2 sons.
Tell me a little bit about your children. And
wonderful. Both my sons are now MDs, and they're both emergency room physicians. And my second husband said that it was my fault that I had instilled too much idealism into my children. They wanted, because my oldest son had a master's from Wharton in business. He was CEO of Kraft Food and Frozen Food Division, but then he decided to go to medical school. Right. As I said, my husband blamed me for that I had.
Well, it's not surprising, because children of Holocaust survivors, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have a heightened sense of empathy. And exactly. So very often they go into something having to do with the helping profession. And even if they're in business, they somehow figure out some way to be involved in something of helping.
Right now, we're trying to help Ukrainians, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about what was it like for you? You got divorced and you had two teenage children. How did you raise children by yourself?
I was working and I was trying to get my master's degree in social work. And I was working at the Deborah schools, counseling.
Right. So you too had a heightened sense of empathy.
Oh yeah, and I kept on going. And eventually I met my husband also. I had been working, but then I met my future husband and we got married. And
And then you had
eventually I had
another,
a
then you
daughter.
had another child. You had a daughter.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about her.
She's in North Carolina right now. And she has a degree as a dramaturg. She's written, when she was 16, she wrote a play that won Young Playwrights of America award. It's as though she were meeting my father after the war. And the name of the play is to 42. And as you can imagine, it's a little bit about what my hope had been, to find my father. And somehow she picked it up,
And how did you get involved in becoming the leader of the Holocaust Child
Well,
Survivors?
Judith Kestenberg convened that meeting of survivors, the American Gathering of Holocaust Survivors had this
In
meeting
Philadelphia, right?
in Philadelphia.
1984.
And afterwards, I remember sitting there in the room and I said the stories, well, one person, Dana came from LA and she stood at the head of the table. Yes, we're still friends. And she came and she talked about, she said, they tell us that we cannot remember, but I remember when they took the children by their legs and swung their heads against the wall and the whole room just fell apart. And it was the last session of the meeting. It was stinking hot, no air conditioning. And we just sat there. And finally I said, we have to get together again. And Judith said, you can't get together by yourselves. You've been through too much trauma. I said, but here we are now. And I said, who wants to give me their names? We didn't have cell phones back then or anything.
Right.
People came and gave me their names on a piece of paper. So 3 weeks later, not quite 3 weeks, I called people and I had a picnic in my backyard where we lived in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. And people came, and one of them was Michael Gleiberman, who owned the hotel in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Continental Inn. And he was one of those who came. He himself was a survivor also. And he said, we have to get together again. Why don't we all come to my hotel for a weekend and I'll give everybody a good price. So I said, okay, we'll see what happens. And I spread the word, I made calls, and we had 173 people come to the first meeting in Lancaster. And for example, myself, I stayed up all night with Marika Barnett, who's passed away, and another person. The three of us stayed up all night talking about and another man from Montreal, the mothers we got back after the war. That was the theme of what we talked about all night. Because the mothers we got back after the war were not the usual mothers, So, and we've had all these 32 annual conferences. Of course, we had to skip the last 2 years.
Let's hope next year we'll be able to.
We had as many as 900 people when we met in Israel.
Right. Yes, that was quite an event.
Family. We are a family. I always say, when we get together, we don't have to have any introductions. We have instant rapport. We know what we're talking about. We know where we're coming from. And now our children, whom I call 2Gs and 3Gs, are very much involved as well.
I think that's the beautiful thing about the World Federation of Jewish Child Survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants is that the children and the grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors have been joining their parents to come to the meetings, and because very often when they were young, they were not particularly interested in finding out what had happened. And also, I think that one of the things that the organization has done is it has given a voice to the child survivors, because the child survivors felt that, they didn't have a story to tell, and the older survivor said, well, if you don't remember, how can you possibly have been affected? And I think learning from each other has helped people have a narrative of their own experience. And so not only did you form a community, but you also gave people a sense of identity. And that is something that is very, very important. And also an identity of one of, yes, you were victimized, but indeed you are not victims. And I mean, if you take a look at, yourself having, been through a terrible marriage and saying, I'm not going to be a victim here. And, you move on and, you have a family and now you have, you have 7 grandchildren. And so that we now have
I call them my grandchildren, I call my nachas bundles.
Yes, they sure are.
I have 3 grandchildren, 3 children, 7 grandchildren.
7 grandchildren. It's beautiful.
And my grandson is living with me now, my one grandson.
Oh, how beautiful.
Practicing for the marathon in LA.
Well, I'm sure that your children and your grandchildren are very proud of you, and the fact that, you were able to give them a lot of love. And so that they can now spread that in the work that they're doing in the world.
But can I say something? It's our children and grandchildren. It's not just that they want to retell, come together with us. It's that they, in fact, the second generation are now have become very active in learning our survivor stories, because they feel I'm among the youngest and we're on the way out. Right. They need to be the ones telling the stories now of survival, because there are not going to be many of us left. And those stories have to continue, their stories have to live. So that's what they're practicing to do.
Well, Stefanie, I'm so glad that you gave me the opportunity to interview you.
And I thank you.
And we will be sharing it with your children. And,
I hope so. I was going to ask you.
Absolutely, so that they can continue to tell your story when the time comes, which I hope is not going to be for many years to come.
Well, it's, as I said, what's happening now in the Ukraine definitely very much affects us survivors, very much so.
Yes, particularly a lot of the images that you shared with us today of having to run from place to place.
Yeah.
And dodging.
Never knowing where you'll be safe, never knowing. I'm sure they're having the same experiences, who's going to be there for you. Exactly. Thank you so much for having this interview with me.
Yeah, thank you.
And your long continuation in this project. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eva Fogelman, for sharing your expertise and for your thoughtful questions. Thank you to Stefanie for joining us on this episode today. It has been an honor to hear your story and see how you've used your experience as a guiding light for your work advocating on behalf of other survivors. Hearing you tell your story, I could feel how you have used your own experience to inform your work, and I just want to stress again how admirable that is. That's all the time we have today on the Blue Cards podcast, Stories of the Holocaust, Overcoming Historical Trauma. Please join us next time.